I'm going to tell you something that most political commentators won't say out loud because it makes everyone uncomfortable. What happened in that courtroom today? That wasn't politics as usual. That was the system showing its teeth. And I don't mean that in some conspiratorial, shadowy cabal kind of way. I mean something much simpler and frankly more terrifying. We just watched the American political establishment demonstrate in real time what happens when you cross certain invisible lines. We watched the machine decide someone was no longer worth protecting, and then we watched that person's entire operational capacity collapse in less than 6 hours. 6 hours. Let me walk you through what actually went down, because the news coverage is missing the forest for the trees. If you want to operate at a high level in American politics, you need three things working for you simultaneously. Think of them as life support systems. You can survive if one fails, maybe even two, but if all three go down at once, you're done. First, the courts have to tolerate you. And I don't mean they have to like you or agree with you. I mean they have to treat you like a legitimate player in the game. They enforce the rules, sure, but they give you room to maneuver. They let your lawyers do their thing. They don't turn every procedural issue into a federal case. That's what tolerance looks like in the legal system. Second, money has to trust you, not love you, not even support your ideology. Just trust that you're a stable bet. Big money doesn't actually care that much about your politics. What it cares about is predictability. Can they model your behavior? Can they quantify the risk of being associated with you? If the answer is yes, money flows. If it's no, money disappears faster than you can say bank run. Third, the institutional establishment has to be willing to absorb your chaos. Political parties, media organizations, regulatory bodies, they all have a certain tolerance for disruption. If you stay within that tolerance zone, they'll defend you, make excuses for you, provide cover when you need it. But there's a threshold, and once you cross it, they don't fight you. They just step back. And when they step back, you're suddenly facing the full force of every system with no buffer. Now, here's what made today different from every other bad news day in politics. All three of those systems failed at the exact same moment. The dominoes fall around 2:47 p.m. Eastern senior legal counsel walked out, just stood up and left mid-proceeding. Now, if you've never worked in high-stakes legal situations, you might think lawyers quit all the time when things get tough, but that's not how elite legal representation works. When you hire top-tier attorneys, you're not just buying courtroom skills, you're buying insulation. These people are human shields whose entire job is to stand between you and every possible form of legal, reputational, and financial blowback. They're the firewall. So when they publicly walk away in the middle of a proceeding, they're not making a statement. They're sending a signal to everyone else in the ecosystem. The risk here just went exponential. Get out while you can. And guess what happened next? Within hours, not days, not weeks, hours, over $200 million in pledged campaign funding evaporated. Here's the thing that's wild about this. There was no coordination, no donor conference call, no organized effort to pull funding. It was pure emergence. Dozens of high net worth individuals operating completely independently all looked at the same data points and reached the same conclusion at the same time. I need to get my name away from this now. That's how smart money actually works. It's not ideological. It's not personal. It's mathematical. These people are constantly running risk calculations. And when multiple risk indicators spike simultaneously, legal counsel bailing, courts getting aggressive, media narrative shifting, the algorithm in their head says, sell, and they sell. No emotions, no loyalty, just cold assessment. And then came the quietest collapse of all. Institutional support just vanished. No dramatic announcements, no public disavowals, just silence. Phone calls that used to get returned within an hour now go to voicemail. Party officials who used to provide air cover suddenly have nothing to say. Establishment figures who would normally come to your defense are mysteriously unavailable. This is how the system actually removes people it's decided aren't worth protecting anymore. Not with force, but with absence. Why this changes everything. Here's what you need to understand. These three systems, legal, financial, institutional, they're connected. They feed off each other. When one starts to collapse, it sends shockwaves through the others, and you get what engineers call a cascade failure. The lawyers leave, which signals to the money that risk is uncontrollable, so money flees, which signals to the institutions that this person is now toxic, so institutions withdraw, which sends another signal back to the legal and financial worlds, which accelerates everything even faster. It's a death spiral, and once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop. What we witnessed today was the system transitioning someone from operational to contained. They can still talk. They can still hold rallies. They might even still have passionate supporters, but they can't function at the elite level anymore. They can't access serious capital. They can't maintain complex institutional relationships. They can't operate sophisticated political machinery. They've been, for all practical purposes, removed from the game. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but this is just about one person. Why should I care? And that's exactly the wrong question. Because what you should be asking is, if the system can do this to one person, what stops it from doing it to anyone? The new rules of the game. Right now, in strategy sessions across the country, political operatives are completely recalibrating what electable means. It used to be about polls, fundraising numbers, media favorability, message discipline. Those things still matter, but they've been subordinated to a new priority: institutional compatibility. Translation: can you play the game without triggering the containment protocols we just witnessed? Parties are now pre-screening candidates not for ideology, but for stability. Before you get access to real resources, you have to prove you won't create the kind of legal, financial, or institutional chaos that leads to cascade failures. If you can't prove that, you can still run, but you're going to hit what insiders are calling the outsider ceiling. For the last decade, American politics has been dominated by outsiders, people who ran against the establishment, people who won specifically because they weren't part of the system. But that window is closing, and it's closing fast. You can still generate grassroots energy. You can still pack stadiums. You can still dominate social media. But if you can't maintain legal stability, capital confidence, and institutional tolerance, you'll win primaries and then hit a wall in the general election. You'll create movements that can't translate into governing power. The system just demonstrated that it has a kill switch, and now every future candidate knows it exists. Here's how it's playing out already. Big donors are implementing what they call stability metrics. Before they write checks, they're assessing, can this person survive legal scrutiny? Can they handle regulatory examination? Can they maintain relationships under pressure? If the answer is uncertain, the money doesn't flow. Political parties are rationing resources based on compatibility scores. Candidates who play nicely with institutional norms get full access to voter data, staff support, and organizational infrastructure. Candidates who don't get the bare minimum. Courts are enforcing procedural compliance with zero tolerance. For years, political actors used legal proceedings as theater. Delay tactics, media opportunities, defiance performances. Courts are shutting that down hard. What all of this adds up to is a containment architecture for populism, and it doesn't matter if it's left-wing populism, right-wing populism, or anything in between. If you're running on an anti-establishment platform, you're now running through a gauntlet specifically designed to filter you out. The danger nobody's talking about. But here's where things get really concerning. Containment doesn't always produce compliance. Sometimes it produces radicalization. Because when you close off institutional pathways, movements don't always moderate. Sometimes they double down. They build parallel structures, alternative funding networks, alternative media ecosystems, alternative sources of authority that don't depend on establishment approval. And that's already happening. Alternative media platforms are exploding. Crowdfunding is replacing traditional donor networks. Cryptocurrency is enabling financial flows that bypass traditional banking. Competing legitimacy structures are emerging. What happens when a country has multiple political ecosystems that don't recognize each other as legitimate? History has some answers, and none of them are good. The legitimacy crisis. Because here's the really uncomfortable truth. The same event we witnessed today is being interpreted in two completely incompatible ways, and both interpretations are coherent. One narrative: A political actor violated norms, courts enforced accountability, legal counsel withdrew appropriately, capital fled rationally, and institutions imposed legitimate boundaries. The system worked. The other narrative: an outsider challenged power, courts weaponized procedure, lawyers were pressured to abandon ship, money coordinated to strangle a movement, and the establishment eliminated a threat. The system protected itself. Both of these stories explain all the available evidence. Both have historical precedents. Neither can prove the other wrong. And that's the crisis, because when half the country sees justice and the other half sees suppression, and neither side can even agree on what framework to use for evaluating what happened, democracy becomes really, really difficult. Democracy requires some basic shared beliefs: that elections are legitimate, that courts are neutral, that institutions serve the common good, that everyone plays by the same rules. But what happens when those beliefs fracture? When different groups develop completely different understandings of how the system works and who it serves? You get what political scientists call a multipolar legitimacy environment, which is a fancy way of saying people can't agree on who has the right to make decisions, and there's no shared authority everyone trusts to resolve disputes. Every democracy that's reached this point has ended up in one of three places: authoritarian takeover, territorial partition, or sustained low-level conflict with gradual state breakdown. None of those options involve democracy surviving intact. What happens next? So what does 2026 look like? Here's my read: smaller, safer candidate pools. A lot of people who might have run will be quietly discouraged, not through force, but through realistic assessments that they won't get the institutional support needed to win. Earlier consolidation around safe candidates. Primary contests will narrow faster than usual as money and party infrastructure coalesce around people who check all the stability boxes. Stability over excitement. General elections will favor boring competence over charismatic disruption. The candidate with better institutional relationships will beat the candidate with bigger rallies. Governance paralysis. Whoever wins will face immediate legitimacy challenges from roughly half the country, making coalition building nearly impossible. Accelerating ecosystem divergence. Alternative media, funding, and organizing structures will keep growing, creating increasingly separate political realities. The choice. And this brings us to you, because you're not a spectator here. Every choice you make about what media you consume, how you evaluate political events, how you engage in discourse, what you prioritize in candidates, all of that shapes the legitimacy environment we collectively inhabit. Rebuilding shared legitimacy would require everyone to give something up. People who benefit from current institutions would need to acknowledge legitimate grievances and accept real reform. People challenging those institutions would need to distinguish between necessary disruption and destructive chaos. All of us would need to value truth over team loyalty. The question is, do you care more about winning the argument, or do you care more about preserving the possibility of shared self-governance? Because eventually, you have to choose. You can have the satisfaction of being absolutely certain you're right and the other side is wrong. Or you can have a functional democracy where people with different views can still live under the same system. History suggests you can't have both for very long. What happened in that courtroom today was a demonstration of power. The system showed what it can do when it decides someone has gone too far. And now everyone knows the rules have changed. The question is, what are you going to do with that information?